And now, a passage from William Walker by John M. Bass from the American Historical Magazine, July 1898. Of the millions of people who make up the population of the United States, an infinitesimally small proportion have ever heard of William Walker. Of these, some remember him as a man who made war on a country with which his own was at peace, falling therefore within the general definition of filibuster. Others know of him only by his romantic career, or by the fanciful sobriquet which he either assumed or permitted his friends to give him. Others know of him as one who contemplated the extension to Central America of the slave system already moribund in the United States, and by this promise sought Southern support for his plans. Others who had commercial interests in Nicaragua regarded him as an unscrupulous adventurer, and to this class he largely owed his ruin. The men who followed him and shared his fortunes even to death knew him not as the advance agent of the slaveholder, nor as the self-proposed founder of a Central American republic, nor as one who sought to free Sonora and Nicaragua from the oppression of unjust rulers or the horrors of annual revolution. They knew, in fact, little of his plans, but Walker had qualities which have always commanded the admiration and support of men. He was cool and decided. He was just and faithful to his friends, but above all, his men braved themselves to recklessness, worshipped his magnificent courage. William Walker was born in Nashville, May 8th, 1824. His father, James Walker, was a Scotchman who was first a merchant, then president of the commercial insurance company at Nashville, and his mother's name in Norvell would indicate that she also was Scotch. Both parents are described as of strong and somewhat stern character. There's little memorable in the early years of the man who became successively a doctor, lawyer, editor, president of a republic, major general, and president of another republic, the subject of deep concern to England, a thorn in the side of two administrations in the United States, and yet died at 36. He is described by his contemporaries, many of whom yet live, as cold, quiet, studious, painfully modest, slight, effeminate, almost insignificant in appearance. One says of him that he was uncompanionable, and another speaks of him as a boy who remained long in apron strings. He was graduated from the University of Nashville in 1838, and from the Medical College of the University of Philadelphia in 1843. In this class from Tennessee were Drs. W.A. Cheatham, J.P. McFarland, and John Berrien Lindsley. And another member of it was Elisha Kane, the explorer whom fate led to find the seed of mortal disease in the far north, as Walker found bloody death in the far south. Walker completed his medical studies in Edinburgh and then traveled in Europe. He seems on his return to have remained but a short time at Nashville, and went to New Orleans where he studied law and became an editor. He remained there till 1850, when he went to California, but before leaving New Orleans he had been offended by an article in a rival paper, and going direct to the office of the author had severely cowhided him. At San Francisco, one of his editorials brought on him, for contempt of court, a sentence of fine and imprisonment. He there fought 2 duels, in one of which he was shot in the foot, and by scraping sand over the blood with his other foot attempted to conceal his injury and get another shot. It is said he was all his life unskilled in the use of firearms. Giving up journalism, he practiced law at Maryville, thence visited Sonora, and on his return to California began his plans for colonization. He made an unsuccessful effort to obtain a contract or concession from Mexico for the establishment of a colony in Sonora, which would protect it from the Apaches. A similar concession had been made to a French company, which had proved unsatisfactory to Mexico and disastrous to its projectors. Walker, not deterred by the absence of Mexican permission, secured a small vessel, some money and men, and sailing from San Francisco toward Sonora, seized on November 3, 1853, the town of La Paz in Lower California, capturing its governor and archives. Whatever promises of support he had either in Sonora or from friends in San Francisco, it was unparalleled audacity to take forcible possession of a whole state with 43 men. Walker was no buccaneer to fill his vessel with booty and flee. He remained to erect a republic which he called Sonora, and which included the state of that name, and Lower California held an election by which he was chosen president, issued a Declaration of Independence, a proclamation, formed a cabinet, and established offices, the filling of which reduced his army to 34 men, and wrote his friends that his government was formed upon a firm and sure basis. Recruits soon arrived from San Francisco, but these were of a character so lawless that 2 were soon court-martialed and shot, 2 others were publicly whipped from camp, and a number of others disarmed and permitted to leave. Walker began again his movement towards Sonora, and having no vessel with which to cross the Gulf of California, marched the whole length of Lower California, and crossing the Colorado River on rafts, finally reached the long-sought but inhospitable territory, which, without its knowledge, he had incorporated into his new republic. Here Walker met repeated reverses, and his little force was daily diminished by disease, desertion, and battle. He began a reluctant retreat toward the American frontier, and harassed at every mile by Mexicans and Indians, he reached San Diego May 8, 1854, and there surrendered his army, 34 in all, to an officer of the United States. The party were paroled to appear for trial for violation of the neutrality laws of the United States, and thus ended the 6 months' existence of the independent Republic of Sonora. Of his next expedition, Walker has left a detailed and apparently accurate account in his book, published in 1860. 3 years after his expulsion, and entitled The War in Nicaragua. His plans for this were laid with greater care than those for his first experiment in building republics. There had been aimed at him from Washington in January 1854 a presidential proclamation in which Mr. Pierce had urged all United States officers, civil and military, to use every effort to arrest and bring to trial all persons engaged in filibustering. And in the following December, in his second annual message to Congress, he again alludes to filibustering plans and says, "The energy and activity of our civil and military authorities have frustrated the designs of those who meditated expeditions of this character, except in 2 instances. One of these, composed of foreigners, this was the French company, was at first countenanced by the Mexican government itself, it having been deceived as to the real object. The other small in number succeeded in reaching the Mexican territories, but the effective measures taken by this government compelled the abandonment of the undertaking." And in his third annual message, December 31st, 1855, 7 months after Walker had sailed for Nicaragua, the president appeals to Americans to abstain from unlawful intervention in the affairs of Nicaragua, and rather complacently refers to his preventive measures, which on similar occasion had the best results in securing the peace of Sonora and Lower California. The preventive measures seem to have been that Walker gladly surrendered to a United States officer after his return from Sonora and was paroled for a trial, after which he was promptly acquitted. Walker was therefore now anxious to fix his legal status, and for this purpose an associate went to Nicaragua. This was an inviting field. Its territory touched both oceans, and was easily accessible from California and the southern states, whence Walker ultimately drew his recruits. Its people were idle and regardless of public affairs. It controlled the Great Lake, and was then engaged in a civil war which might be made to inure the benefit of a bold outsider. The contract obtained by his associate Walker rejected for the reason that it was in violation of the neutrality laws of the United States. The associate returned, and in December 1854 secured a contract from the leader of one of the 2 rival factions of Nicaragua, and who, being in possession of most of the country, was probably the de facto president. Under this contract, which Walker accepted, he was to land 300 colonists liable to military duty in Nicaragua, who were to receive fixed monthly wages and a land grant of 50,000 acres, and become citizens if they chose. Walker submitted this contract to the United States District Attorney at San Francisco, to General Wool, then in command of the Pacific Division, and to Colonel John C. Fremont, who were satisfied with the legality of the scheme and encouraged it. Walker admits in his book that he did not think it proper to communicate to these gentlemen his views for the extension of slavery. This time there was no attempt at concealment, and it was subsequently asserted in Congress that when Walker sailed from San Francisco, he was saluted by cannon of the American government under the national flag. His force was a fourth larger than his Sonora army, for he now had 56 men, 6 of whom had served in his first expedition. Walker says of his comrades, "They were most of them men of strong character, tired of the humdrum of common life, and ready for a career which might bring them the sweets of adventure or the rewards of fame." Landing in Nicaragua June 15, 1855, the adventurers were on the 20th mustered into the Democratic Army as the American Phalanx, of which Walker was regularly commissioned colonel. On the 23rd, had started on a campaign. On the 29th, attacked the town of Rivas, which was defended by 600 legitimists, outnumbering Walker's nominal force 3-1 and his actual force 10-1. And on the 30th, were in full but orderly retreat, having lost 18 men, including the lieutenant colonel and major of the phalanx. The dates are given to show the decision of the man. They had killed 300 of the enemy and had learned how little confidence could be placed in the courage or fidelity of their native allies. 110 of these, who had been incorporated into the phalanx, quietly disappeared almost at the first shot, and Colonel Walker had reason to believe that notice of his intended attack on the town had been given to the enemy by his own commander-in-chief, General Munoz. The history of one battle is with varying results, the history of 12, always fighting superior numbers and nearly always victorious, usually the attacking party, frequently short of ammunition and forced to melt church bells and old iron into shot. Without certain supplies of food or medicine, Walker had to rely only on the superior organization, marksmanship, and bravery of his little band of Americans and his own indomitable courage and fortitude. In October 1855, the two parties in Nicaragua made a treaty of peace, and this has been said to be largely the result of the efficient military service of Walker and his men. A provisional government was formed. Rivas, a Nicaraguan, was made executive for 14 months unless an election was ordered sooner, and Walker made commander-in-chief of the army with the rank of general of division. In taking the oath of office, Walker knelt before the crucifix and the symbols of the Catholic Church. 3 weeks after the formation of the new government, Walker had intercepted treasonable letters from its Minister of War to friends in Honduras. This man was quickly tried by a court-martial composed of Americans and promptly shot. In June 1856, Commander-in-Chief Walker issued an address to the people of Nicaragua, reciting the misdeeds of the administration, of which he had been a member for 9 months, denouncing it for its crimes, declaring it dissolved, and announcing that he, in the name of the people, had organized a provisional government until the nation exercises its natural right of electing its own rulers. It is almost needless to add that by the exercise of this natural right, Walker was elected, and on July 12th, was, with all due civil and religious observances, inaugurated President of the Republic of Nicaragua. He immediately formed a cabinet composed of natives, and a week later officially received the United States minister, who began the usual address with the sentence, "I am directed by the President of the United States to notify you that I am instructed to establish relations with this state." Walker, in writing of this incident, says, "It is true the government at Washington had so instructed its minister, but at the time it was not expected that Walker would be in possession of the Nicaraguan government." The President of the United States had formally recognized as President of the Republic of Nicaragua the man against whom he was periodically issuing proclamations as a criminal, against whose plans he had warned all law-abiding Americans, and to whose arrest he had urged all United States officers. Walker, before his election as president, had found the other Central American states suspicious and jealous of the rapidly growing American influence in Nicaragua. In March 1856, the president of Costa Rica had declared war not against Nicaragua, but against the filibusters in her service, and in this, 3 other states ultimately joined. There had been organized some years prior to these events in New York a corporation named the American Atlantic and Pacific Ship Canal Company, commonly called the Transit Company, with Cornelius Vanderbilt as president and stockholders in America and England. It was to furnish transportation for freight, mail, and passengers by land and water across Nicaragua between the two oceans, to build a canal, or a railroad if the canal was impracticable, and for its franchise was to pay the government $10,000 per year and 1/10 of its net profits. It was claimed by Walker that the company owed Nicaragua more than $250,000, had failed to build either canal or railroad, had violated its charters in various ways, and when called on to adjust these differences, had treated the demand with contempt. Legal proceedings had been started before Walker became president, by which the company's charters had been revoked, its property seized and declared forfeited, and a new charter given in 1856 to some American friends of Walker. Walker had heretofore encountered only the difficulties which beset one engaged in similar enterprises, but by his policy toward the transit company, he had created a new and formidable opponent. He had challenged Wall Street, and it responded promptly. As some of the stockholders of the company were English, its local agents were authorized to invoke the aid in the protection of its property of the commander of any man of war of Her Britannic Majesty's Navy. Vessels of the American and English Navy appeared on the Nicaraguan coast. The Nicaraguan minister at Washington found his position rendered so unpleasant that he resigned. The Costa Rican consul general at London received from the English government an offer of 2,000 rifles at a reduced price. One writer states, though Walker does not, that the president of Costa Rica received a large check from the president of the transit company to aid in prosecuting the war against Walker, and several of Mr. Pierce's later and Mr. Buchanan's earlier messages call the attention of Congress to the destruction of private property of American citizens in Nicaragua and the obstruction to transportation of mail and passengers over the transit route. The four other republics of Central America, with many malcontent Nicaraguans, waged an aggressive and merciless war against Walker. His men began to desert in whole companies, and after a long and bloody defense of the town of Rivas, the scene of his first battle, and when his army was eating the flesh of mules and dogs, with many protests and remonstrances against what he denounced as unwarranted and outrageous interference, he yielded to the peremptory order of surrender of Captain Davis of the United States warship St. Mary. He stipulated for the protection of himself and men, and particularly for that of his Nicaraguan allies who were to remain in the country, then broke up his artillery, burned his stores and magazines, and riding defiantly at the head of his army of 462 sick, wounded, and hungry men, left Nicaragua, but not for long. He had held the country for 20 months, and had during that time drawn to his desperate cause 2,843 men, mostly from California. There were, in addition, some native volunteers and conscripts, and it has been estimated that first and last he had 3,500 men. He lost about one-third of his Americans, and the reports of his surgeons show that the proportion of wounds treated was 137 to every 100 men. The Allied army had about 20,000 men and some Indian auxiliaries, and lost nearly half, which was largely due to cholera. It is worthy of mention that the course of Captain Davis in forcing Walker to surrender leave the country did not become a matter of national attention in America, or excite the indignation of Walker's friends, as did similar action by Commodore Paulding later. Walker, on his return to the United States, was received everywhere from New York to New Orleans with the greatest enthusiasm except at Washington. The writer saw him at Nashville in a carriage surrounded by hundreds of people. He made speeches at Nashville, Murfreesboro, and elsewhere, in which he declared his intention of returning to Nicaragua, and in the newspapers he invited men to join him.